Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our class on the life of David. Today we are in Lesson 17, entitled David's Trouble at Home. We're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 13 and 14 as we look at this text together. In our last class, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, David was confronted by the prophet Nathan over his sins. Included in this confrontation, though, was a list of the consequences that David would face from his sins. And there's a lesson there, isn't there? Sin comes with consequences. Forgiveness from sins does not take away the consequences of these poor decisions. And David learns that here the hard way. God tells David through Nathan that his sins are forgiven, down in verse 13, 12 and 13. But verse 14, this is 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13, David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. There's forgiveness, but look what happens in verse 14. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. Then Nathan went to his house. And so even though David was forgiven, it didn't take away the consequences from his sin. And so one such consequence, verse 14, is that the child he had with Bathsheba would die. And it did. It died. The child died. Another consequence, back in verse 10 of chapter 12, says that the sword will never depart from his house. He would have continual strife within his home. And then in verse 11, I will raise up evil against you from your own home. Someone from within his own home would rise up against him. And then in verse 11 and 12, his wives will be taken from him in broad daylight by a companion. And the reason for these punishments is that twice Nathan says that David has despised the Lord through his decisions. In verse 9 it says, why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? And then down in verse 10 it says, therefore the sword shall never depart from your house because you have despised me and taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. David had despised the Lord. Despised, rejected, turned his back to the commands of God. The other reason that these consequences, these punishments are coming upon David, it's not just because he despised the Lord and turned his back on God, but you also see in verse 14 that God says, nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord. Some versions will say that you gave occasion for the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme God. His sin brought shame upon the name of the name of God, the name of the Lord, for which he was the king of his nation. He brought shame on God, and there was going to come with some consequences from it. Had David simply asked the Lord to have provided what he felt like he was lacking, you look at verse 8. Verse 8, it says, I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. You hear that pleading? If you needed more, why didn't you ask? If there was something you felt like you were missing, why didn't you ask? I've given you all this. Don't you think I would have given you more? But instead of asking and seeking God, he selfishly, sinfully took what was not his to have. And he sinned against God and against man. And so chapter 13 of 2 Samuel opens with the fulfillment of God's punishment about the sword devouring his house. To reflect on a fact that we've considered in previous lessons, David at this point in his life has multiple wives and multiple children through his multiple wives. Amnon is the firstborn from Ahinoam of Jezreel. That's 2 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 2. The text here in this story tells us that Amnon loves his half-sister, whose name is Tamar. It says in verse 1 that he loved her. That word love, though, really shouldn't be love. I think a more accurate read of that should say that he lusted for her. I mean, she was beautiful. She was beautiful and she was attractive. We know from James 1 verse 13, when lust is conceived, sin is born, and the sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So here is Amnon, and he has these impure thoughts already in his heart, because it says in verse 2, Amnon was so tormented that it made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for Amnon to do anything to her. Already in his heart, he's struggling with lust, he's struggling with impure thoughts towards his sister, and here comes along a friend. A worthless friend. His name is Jonadab, verse 3. He is David's nephew. He's Amnon's cousin. He's very shrewd. He's very clever. And he helps devise this plan that Amnon used against Tamar in verse 5. That tells us, too, that even though Amnon was the one who carried forth this plan, his friend Jonadab shares just as much guilt in this scene and in this sin as Amnon does. Verse 5, Jonadab says to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, let my sister Tamar come to me and give me bread to eat and prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat it from her hand." And that's exactly what he did. He helped devise this plan for Amnon to get Tamar. And when the situation's over, where is the friend? When Amnon is confronted, where's the friend? Tells you a lot about this friend, doesn't it? You compare these two wicked young men with Tamar, the sister, who in verses 8 through 10, when Amnon is conducting this plan, tells him that she came to care for him who is sick. She came, she cooked a big meal, she agreed to feed it to him, and the story plays out. Amnon grabs her intending evil, which she knew. As soon as he grabs her, she knew that he was intending to do something very, very wrong, very sinful. And so she pleads with him to stop. Such a disgraceful thing is not done in all of Israel. In verse 12, she says, this is sin, this is disgraceful, it's despicable, stop this action. She pleads in verse 13, you hear the pleading, think of me, where will I go to get rid of this reproach? As a defiled woman, Tamar knew she could hardly be a respectful wife for someone after this. How could she hold her head up after this event, after this would take place? She pleads to himself, think of yourself. You will be seen as one of the fools in Israel. This will have a lasting consequence on you. Stop and think. You hear the wisdom of this good woman, this good sister who came out of the kindness of her heart to care for her brother, but all that's in his heart. Already there before his friend, but his friend has provided the path and the avenue and the plan to allow his lust to find its fulfillment. She pleads, don't do this. Think about me. Think about yourself. And then on verse 13, let me ask our Father, he will give us in marriage if this is really it. Please don't do this. Let's at least, let's go about this the right way, the right path. Let's get married the respectful way. I mean, since the law prohibited marriage between a brother and a sister, it's doubtful that David would have let them get married, but at least it would have stalled this impulsive sin that her brother was trying to do, but that wasn't it. That wasn't it. It wouldn't do it. You see, though, within her heart that even after he rapes her, she pleads with him to uphold the law. Verse 16, she said to him, "No, my brother, this is wrong, and sending me away. Sending me away is greater than the other that you have done to me." The law taught that if a man took a woman, he was to pay the father 50 shekels of silver and take her as a wife. That's Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 and 29. And so after Amnon rapes her, she pleads with him to do the respectful thing. And maybe that's not even the right word, to do the right thing. And that is to pay the price and to marry her and to have her as his wife. Because what you see here is a woman who's trying to salvage some scrap of hope for her future. But you see the ugliness in Amnon's heart. Verse 1, he loved her. Verse 15, it says, then Amnon hated her with very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And he said to her, "Get up, go." And down in verse 17, he called the young man who served him and said, "Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her." He used her, and he abused her, and then he got rid of her. The text says he hated her. Once he had satisfied his lust, he found out that it wasn't what he thought it was going to be. Perhaps he thought it was going to be this great moment when she would be just as happy and pleased. But very likely he was left feeling guilty and ashamed. Very likely she was crying and upset as he forced himself. And instead of caring for her, he just threw her out like garbage, like trash. Evil, cruel, heartless, selfish. In such a dark moment in Scripture. Now, pause here for a moment. Think about this for a minute with me. Parents, what can we teach our kids from this section here? What can parents teach their children from this section? Well, number one, friends have such a huge impact on our lives. They do. We don't need to say this second-handedly as if it's something that's just commonplace, like a bumper sticker saying. When Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15:33, "Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals." He says that for a reason. It is true. Bad company, bad friends, the people you choose as your close associations will have an influence in your life. Though Amnon had lust in his heart, Jonadab gave him the push to do the wrong, to commit the sin. Our friends shape our thinking and encourage our behavior. Friendships are so very important, and we have to teach that to our children. Be very careful about the friends you pick in your life. I think something else to teach our kids is the difference between lust and love. One is right and one is wrong. It's okay to be attracted to others, but lust is never okay. And remind ourselves from Proverbs 27 verse 3, "As a man thinks, so he is." Love puts others before ourselves. Love seeks the other's best interest. And you don't see that here. Amnon did not love his sister. He lusted for her. And that lust drove him to doing some really horrible things. He was fueled by his passions, not by wisdom and with sound thinking. Well, the sad commentary from this section is verse 21. All this has taken place, and we read this and we think, all right, David, King David, giant slayer David, David who has come through a horrible time in his life. Let's see David come and make this right. Come and protect your daughter, defend her honor. You need to answer to your son. You need to make him answer for what he has done. Verse 21 of our section reads, "When King David heard of all these things, he was very angry." And there's a translation that reads, "King David heard of these things, was very angry, but he did not grieve the spirit of his son Amnon, because he loved him, for he was his firstborn." Maybe. Perhaps the reason David didn't confront his sin was that he still faced the guilt over his own sin. I mean, who are you to be telling me that I'm wrong, Dad? You just did something awful yourself, something that was wrong with the sexual sin. Who are you? Who are you to speak to me? David didn't do anything. He didn't say anything. He didn't address his son. It became obvious here that David was going to do nothing about Amnon, and in this void, David's son Absalom takes matters into his own hands. Absalom, verse 22, hated Amnon, and for 2 years he's been devising this plan. Absalom is the full brother to Tamar, same mother, same father, and so for 2 years he has been devising this plan. He invites David and his brothers to a feast to celebrate the completing of the sheep shearing season. Say that 3 times fast. While there, they got Amnon drunk with wine, and Absalom's servants killed him. Verse 28 and 29. Well, in the commotion, the rest of the sons flee out of fear, not knowing, well, what's going on? Are we next? Is someone killing all the sons? Well, the news is told to David that his sons were killed by Absalom, that not one of them survived. That's down in verse 30. And yet it is Jonadab who tells David that it was only Amnon. Absalom had this in his heart since the day that he had violated his sister. Well, from here, Absalom gets out. He runs. He flees to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. That's down in verse 37. Talmai was his grandfather. You find that out in 2 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 3. Well, Geshur was not very far from Israel. It wasn't very far. It was immediately northeast of the Sea of Galilee. Some versions say that in verse 39 that King David ceased to pursue Absalom. The ESV says the spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom because he was comforted about Amnon since he was dead. So one view of this passage is that David wished to punish Absalom for what he had done, but time passed and his anger was appeased and softened. The other view is that David mourned over Absalom and he desired to make things right, to reconcile with his son. Well, in chapter 14, Joab notices that David is thinking about Absalom. Verse 1. He is thinking, missing Absalom. And so Joab devises this plan to bring about a reconciliation between the two of them. And so he has a wise woman ask a favor of David regarding a similar situation between two sons, one murdered, one the other. And David reveals his merciful heart and his judgment upon the guilty son. And this woman put David in the position of having to explain why he was willing to spare her son, but was not willing to forgive his own son. And so David sees it, and he agrees. And so he sends Joab to bring Absalom home, and he returns. But in verse 24, chapter 14, it shares that he did not see the king's face. Absalom did not see his father's face. In fact, in verse 28 of chapter 14, it says here that Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. 2 years without seeing the king's face. So put together, add 3 years at Geshur, and that's 5 years altogether. 3 years in Geshur, 2 years in Jerusalem. He's gone 5 years without seeing his father face to face. Well, finally, Absalom gets to see the king, and it appears that as if reconciliation was taking place, things were all fine, but a lot's happened in those 5 years. In fact, a lot happened a long time ago. A lot happened 5 years ago when David did not respond to the sin against Tamar the way he should have. Absalom has some other plans, and his plans require that there would be no stopping him from doing what he can to taking over the throne. We'll come to that in the next couple chapters, next couple lessons. Do you notice here, maybe just pausing as we maybe reflect over this study, you notice what you see in David's parenting technique? He didn't do anything. He was absent. And instead of speaking up against his son that sinned, he got angry, but he didn't do anything. It's kind of like Eli the prophet, who knew his son had sins, but he didn't correct his sons. Here's David. He knew his son had done wrong, but he didn't do anything about it. And Absalom is there, but he doesn't go to him. He doesn't seek forgiveness. He doesn't try and make the relationship right. He's an absentee father. Here's the thing, and there's a lesson here for us. 2 things for parents, and then this lesson is going to be wrapped up. Nothing takes the place of our presence with our kids. Nothing will. They need us, especially when they're young, more than ever. They need our presence. They need our teaching. They need our love. They need our correction. They need us there in our lives. And the problem is some of us are there. We're in person. We're in the same room. But we're here. We're on the phone. We're not tuned in. We're not paying attention. And our kids need our attention. They need us clued in. They need us connected to their lives. They need to see that we care for them, that we're interested in them, that we're paying attention to them. Nothing will take the place of your presence. That gap, that distance that took place between Absalom happens all the time today. When parents are too busy to take the time for their kids, to build a relationship, too busy to offer right teaching and wisdom and guidance so that they don't make wrong friends, so they don't learn to live off the impulses of their flesh, that they don't learn to be careful about their choices. Nothing will take the place of your presence among your family. But here's the second lesson, and we learn it well from David. Success in one area of life, greatness in one area of life, does not guarantee greatness in another. David is probably the greatest king that Israel ever had. He will go down in history as one of the greatest kings that Israel ever had. He was a great leader. He was a great warrior. He was a miserable father. So just because we're great in one area, maybe good in leadership, maybe good at in the corporate office, maybe good in the classroom, good at teaching, just because we're good in one area does not mean we're good in another. Here's the catch. Maybe here's the admonition. If you got to be good at something, make it about what matters most. What good would it be to go down in history as this famous CEO who turned around a business? What good would it be to be this leader of a major corporation, to be a teacher that influenced lives of thousands, but I failed, but I neglected, but I was not the parent I was called to be. I was not the leader. I was not the father or mother that God expected me to be, and it cost me the lives of my kids. If in teaching and preaching and sharing the gospel, the only people that we help from here to home are that of our spouses and our spouse and our children, not another soul comes to the gospel, will we not have saved? Will we not have been a success? Will we not have succeeded in this life? David got too caught up in running the kingdom, too caught up perhaps in the guilt of his own sins, that he failed to be a parent in the moment when he needed to be there the most. Nothing will matter more. Be involved in the lives of your families. Be involved in the lives of your children. Teach them. Enjoy them. We only have one chance. May God bless us in our goal and in our role with our families. Thank you so much for studying with me today. I hope you'll come back and study with us again in the future. If you got some questions or thoughts you have, share them with me. I'd love to hear what you're seeing and what you're learning from this study. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.